Welcome back to Subversive, an exclusive conversation series brought to you by Wasafiri. Each month, we will be in conversation with a poet releasing a new collection in 2025. These poets' collections challenge the limits of the Western lyric, exploring living in a turbulent world while holding onto hope. Join us as we discuss their inspirations, politics, writing practice, and more. Today we have Pascale Petit speaking to us about her poetry collection Beast, published by Bloodaxe. Pascale Petit was born in Paris and lives in Cornwall. She's of French, Welsh, and Indian heritage. She has published 9 poetry collections, 4 of which were shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. Her ninth, Beast, published by Bloodaxe Books in 2025, is a Poetry Book Society recommendation. Her previous collections have won the RSL Ondaatje Prize and the inaugural Laurel Prize for Eco Poetry and been shortlisted for various awards. Her debut novel, My Hummingbird Father, was published by Salt in 2024. Welcome, Pascale. It's so lovely to have you here today.
It's lovely to be here, Prerana. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Beast takes us on a kaleidoscopic odyssey through intimately connected private and natural worlds. Beasts of the family and beasts of the wild morph into each other in bedrooms, rainforests, cellars, museums, and open plains. With an expansive and exuberant imagination, Beast asks what it means to survive our family histories on a planet that burns around us, insisting on moments of compassion and rapture to anchor us through. So that's a little bit about your collection from me. To begin with, can you describe your collection in 5 words?
Oh, yes. Uh, Transforming trauma through beauty of animals.
I was trying to think. That could very easily be extended into a haiku, like a little summary of your collections. I wanted to start with so previous collections of yours have engaged with various characters that appear in this book, as well as the places. So I wanted to ask a little bit about how you see this collection fitting in with the wider constellation of your work.
Mm. Um, I think that in every book that I try to go deeper and broader. And as I'm very attached to place, special places for me. So this book, Beast, is quite an expansive book in that it meanders over 5 places in the world, from the Amazon rainforest, which I is my favorite place on earth, very closely followed by the tiger forests of India, which appear in a Parisian cellar in a long prose piece in the book. And in the south of France, the Languedoc and the Camargue, where there's a lot of wildlife, and especially birds and the bulls, and the horses. And there's a brief visit to Gaza, um, and it ends up where I live, near Bodmin Moor. So it kind of meanders through a lot of wild places, wild in different ways.
Mm. And I'm picking up on all of the beasts that you've just mentioned, the animals you've mentioned. So much of the book reads like a bestiary with ecologies and animals from all of these places, and you draw connections between the places, the animals, both real and mythological, including human as animal as well. And I wanted to ask, what does writing through encounter with animals or animals as metaphor allow you to explore in the book?
Mm. Um, I I am naturally drawn to animals and to writing about animals, I think for various reasons. I think when I was a baby, when I was 2 weeks old, I was taken to my Indian grandmother in Wales, in the
Mm.
country, and she had a lot of animals and she had a big garden. So I think I bonded with animals, and that, then I went back to Paris to live with my rather awful parents for a few years, and then I went back to my grandmother. So the animals represent the good for me, and they make life safer. So on the one hand, I feel that they did save me. On the other hand, I'm very aware that these creatures that were really helped me to survive are themselves not surviving. So there is that absolute horror of the feeling that Earth might become a place without animals and bird song, and trying to grasp that without getting very, very depressed about it. Still, so I try to capture what it is about them, how what their ineffable qualities are, and we can never really know what they are, I think. But I do try to capture them in some way in poems so that they're preserved, so that if they do disappear, that they are kind of preserved in little books.
Yeah. It's that companionship and also what being around animals can teach us about ourselves. I think I'm trying to remember, there was this quote by Noor Al-Sadir, and she says that, I'm going to paraphrase really badly now, but I think being around animals, something along the lines of puts us in touch with our instincts, and through that, our instincts into possibilities. And I'm really hearing that in how you said they helped you survive a difficult time. And as you were speaking, and how we can never really know animals, for me, what was really interesting in the book was also the animal registers you used. So words like animal, beast, human, demon, savage, all of these kind of start to blur into one another. And in so many ways, you touched upon Gaza as well in the beginning. Um, there's this language being weaponized, and being likened to an animal is considered, I guess, antithetical to being human or civilized, but that is not true. I think while nature can be merciless, I think nature doesn't have the capacity to be evil in the ways that humans do. And this is something I really took away from your book.
Yes. So my feeling is that animals are innocent.
Mm.
Of course, they do horrid things to other animals because to survive they need to eat and so on, and they need to protect their very vanishing territories. But compared to humans, they are innocent.
Yeah.
Humans have choices,
An agency.
yes, and power, or more power than animals.
Um, like as we were speaking, I was also thinking about predator and prey and that kind of power dynamic, because you just mentioned power, and how the lines between those two also begin to blur a lot, especially when you write about the difficult subject matter within the family. Um, and while you were writing that, I was thinking about how we write about trauma, how we write about what is unsayable. And I think you've done it in a wonderful way where there are a lot of images that explore silence or the inability to voice, like where the speaker's lips are being sewed shut, or there's a turning away, there's an escape into other worlds, into memory. One of your speakers says, I am a door no one can open. And I wanted to ask, what are some of the ways in which you balance opacity and transparency or accessibility when writing about this kind of difficult subject matter?
Mm. Thank you. So when I was a child and a teenager, I was very withdrawn.
Mm.
So I did not speak much. I'm sure I spoke more when I was with my grandmother, but I did kind of have to disappear when I lived with my mother as a teenager. And so there is this notion of silence which also relates to plants, trees, and animals. Although animals make sounds, they can't speak to us. Trees can't speak to us. Maybe they did once, you know. Um, and there is also the fact that I'm writing about very traumatic subjects, child abuse, etc. Um, and I have to somehow, I am not remotely interested in just presenting what happened to me. You know, that is not my concern. What I'm interested in is somehow making something beautiful out of it, transforming it, changing it so that I bring the poems and the stories back into my childhood and my teenage and somehow change it. Um, Out of an act of love, I hope,
Mm,
because what I feel for animals and landscapes is love.
mm,
What I feel for the planet is love,
mm.
especially the natural world. And yes, so that's I've forgotten what the question is now.
Oh,
What
it
was
was just about, yeah, how we write about difficult subject matter. And you've actually touched upon two more things that I'm going to ask you about in a minute. Transformation and love, both of which were big standouts for me while reading. But I do have another follow-up question, which is something I wonder a lot about as well, because I write about personal histories and things also. And one of the things I'm constantly grappling with is how we write about people or experiences while those people are still in our lives or still living, and kind of how to, the ethics of that, like how to respect and be compassionate while also telling your story, because it was also very much like your own story. And that was something I wondered if I could ask you about.
Yes, thank you. That is a big question. And I write what I write because I have to write it to survive. However, I don't want to hurt family members. Um, so, and I also don't or try very hard not to include any living family in my work because their story is different from mine and I have no right to tell their story. So, so there's that. And when I started writing these books, now my very first book, Heart of a Deer, it has a lot more metaphor and camouflage in it. There are a lot more leaves covering the
Like
stories,
foliage.
foliage, definitely.
Yeah.
And that was because my mother was still alive when I wrote it. My father, uh, while while I was writing it, was still a totally vanished father. He'd vanished for 35 years. So that was fine. He was just a mysterious person at that point. And then when I published it, he suddenly appeared, made contact, but he only spoke French. And in any case, he was such a bad father. Didn't feel protective towards him. But to my mother, I did, although she emotionally abused me. Um, she was mentally ill. And so I kept from her the fact that I'd published this book. And she actually died at this time. They both died 25 years ago. So it's been more a question of trying to consider other members of my family.
Thank you for that. That was really considerate. And I think that active compassion really came through. And I think another way in which, for me, these poems go beyond what, like Carolyn Forshey calls poetry of witness,
Mm,
is, I think, what we were talking about earlier, the transformative nature of it, how you harness this very expansive and alchemical imagination to build worlds to slip into. And one of the things I was thinking about a lot in the collection is the many kinds, the doubling of bodies and the motif of the mask that recurs. So a lot of speakers and characters put on and take off layer masks and skins at different points in the book. So bee masks, doe masks. I just made a list of masks as I was going through them. And I was thinking a lot about how this, on one hand, is dissociation while you're experiencing something, but it also was hiding play, kind of reminded me of theater transformation. And also, I kind of because I read Ovid's Metamorphosis ages ago, and then while I was reading this book, it reminded me of that one. I kind of dipped in and out of both at the same time, and yeah, I just wanted to hear more about what harnessing that force of play and transformation did for you in your work.
Mm. Thank you. You've read my book so closely. Thank you.
Oh.
So with Ovid's transformations, metamorphoses, I think that generally that characters change into something else, like trees or animals. Um, when a situation reaches a critical point,
Mm,
uh, sometimes other people change them into these things, but they also change them when you know, like, when whatever is happening has become unbearable. And when I was a child, I have this memory or memories of splitting myself in two
mm,
and a strong self floating up to the ceiling, watching what's happening while the self that's left behind um, maybe is a kind of, I don't know, a husk and doesn't really experience it. She removes herself. So there is that experience that feeds into the work. So a very dark experience. But also, well, I do think that I'm playing when I'm writing poems. Um, Sometimes it's a very serious play, but it is being a child again and bringing that serious play back into the childhood. And I love wearing the animal masks and the beasts, the various beasts, which
mm,
like the Tarasque in the Camargue and the beast of Vacarès, all those strange animals, and the loup de Gévaudan, that's a kind of a werewolf, a huge wolf, anyway. Uh, so yeah, and I think they are also, well, they're helpers in difficult situations, and they are shields.
mm,
They are definitely shields. And I mean, they are so consoling animals, even the pets we have in our houses, they're so healing and consoling. So, and when I when I lived with my grandmother, she used to tell me stories about tigers in India. And I think those stories have stayed with me
mm,
about these incredible wild and scary creatures that she said did not eat her when she
mm,
was a toddler.
mm. I was just about to ask, because when you were describing these big, mythical, beautiful beasts, I was going to ask if you wanted to tell us how you encountered one of these stories, or just tell us one of your favorite
Mm.
myths or stories about one of them.
Yeah, so the story about my grandmother, which I told in my previous book, Tiger Girl, and which I can refer to in this book in the Tala Zone section. Yeah, it's a story she told me many times when I used to sleep in her bed. She had an electric blanket, and we had no heating in this council house in mid Wales. And she would tell me about she was taken in, how she was taken in as a maid, the daughter of a maid, of her
Mm,
father's maid, taken into by this white family, and she was not liked or loved by her, I suppose, stepmother, by the white mother,
mm,
who left her one day in a tent in the jungle when she said she was a baby. And
mm,
she said a tiger walked into the tent and came up to her cot. And she just looked at this tiger. And she did say that she was not frightened. She just
mm,
looked at it and that it walked out and didn't eat her. So,
mm,
so yeah, so that's a kind of myth that I have. Uh,
mm,
well, I'm sure it's based on a true story, but so, there's that idea of the wild kind of, and a baby.
And I think that being the baby or the toddler and having that childlike sense of, oh, what is this big stripy thing, rather than approaching something with fear.
Mm,
I can also, I'm picking up so much on how much love you have for these places and these animals, and love was
mm,
something that came through like reading this collection, even though it dealt with such difficult subject matter, something that I never questioned was like the act of love in writing it, the odes that are kind of through the Cornish hedge, and I think there was one to the Camargue and the Causa, and it was a very beautiful form for me to engage with because it was heavy subject matter, and then the odes just gave me this. It just filled me up with warmth every time I read one.
mm.
And I wanted to ask about love a little bit more as a generative force in the book, and maybe specifically about writing odes in your practice.
Yeah. So my grandmother taught me love because there wasn't love in the rest in the family, from the mother and father. Um, and also she had this garden, and she had a rockery and a shrubbery and a lawn. And I went back to it recently, and it wasn't that big at all. But to me, as a child, and certainly as a baby, it seemed immense. And it was like my atlas of the world.
Mm,
And so the rockery were the mountains that I fell in love with, the shrubbery are the forests that I love, and the lawn, the savannas, where you get the savanna animals. Um, and and I don't know where my joy of life or joy in the natural world comes from, but I
mm,
suspect it must be from her, because that certainly developed through my life, and and um, and then, so I fell in love with waterfalls by going to Scotland. And then I got a book of waterfalls and saw the highest waterfall in the world was in Venezuela, in the Venezuelan Amazon, Angel Falls. So I went to Angel Falls. And from there, my love of the Amazon rainforest expanded to everything about it. Its peoples, its trees, its animals, just everything, the rivers. Yeah. So, and really, I think that as a species, I think the only hope we have is uh, love and kindness and empathy. And I think that there is actually more than appears, because it's not the kind of thing that's repeated so much in the media. The sensational bad things are expanded in the media, but the quiet acts of kindness and empathy that people are doing everywhere, I just hope that that's going to save us.
me too. I think if there's anything to hold on to, it's that, these acts of love. And I think in the poems, there was also this sense of, and maybe I'm reading into it, so please correct me if I'm wrong. This even when writing some of these poems about your family, it felt very reparative, almost the poem itself being this vessel of being able to love someone through, and this space of imagination, imaginative love in a way, that I found really beautiful.
Yeah, so I definitely, because turning my father into a beast or an animal or even a stinging but funny insect
Mm,
makes me love him in a way, because he was a human being, so, and he had his own problems and reasons why he became abusive. So yeah, it's just so important, and I think that I write out of joy, even if I'm writing about very difficult things, war and so on, child abuse. Yeah, so I want the joy of life to
come
be
through.
in my poems. Yeah.
Yeah. Um,
But
Speaking of that kind of, sorry.
sorry, I didn't say anything about odes, did I? So I think there's three odes in the book, and they've got long lines, and they're kind of praise poems, and they're very expansive. So yes, in a way, they're because it's very hard to write about landscape, I think, in a forceful way. So it's an attempt to write about the landscape, which of course is the planet.
Mm.
That's that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking about place and scale because when you were saying, oh, you encountered this hedge as a child, and it seemed like a whole world opened up from the perspective of a baby or a young toddler. And I'm thinking about these kind of transpositions that you do when you write about nature
Hmm.
and nature writing as a label or a genre as a whole thing. But I was really interested. There were clearly five sections that deal with specific places, but often being in one place means you're pulled into another one. So a claustrophobic journey through a cellar in Paris doubles as a wander into an animal reserve in India. And the vast Amazon is terraformed in Wales.
Hmm.
Um, and there is this sense of very interconnected root systems, but also a certain rootlessness when it comes to writing about these multiple places in relation to each other. So I wanted to ask what that kind of layering or transposition of place helped you express in the work.
Well, first of all, I actually feel rootless myself. I don't
Mm,
seem to have a set home. Um, then if I just take one, if I take Tala Zone, which is set in this terrible cellar in Paris, in the apartment where we lived when I was a child, and I used to be put in the cellar. Um, and I went there recently twice and looked at it, and it really was more horrific than I remembered.
mm,
I'd had nightmares about it. I even made an installation about it when I was at art school. Uh, I thought the only way to make it bearable, but also maybe universal, because a lot of people are in claustrophobic places like prisons, um, is to bring the joy of the Indian tiger forest into it and all the things that my grandmother taught me. And so those things appear there, and the things that I actually observed, the different animals, and so not just the tigers, but the hornbills and um, all the joyful birds, incredible paradise birds and parrots and everything. Uh,
Um, I was just gonna ask, so I think was the trip to India to that animal reserve recent?
yes, yes. So I went there. It's just before the
Mm,
COVID, actually. So there's my cat.
mm,
Um, Twice I went, and I spent several weeks altogether in Bandhavgarh National
Mm.
Park in Madhya Pradesh. And yeah, so it's still very vivid in my mind. Um, and I'm always, I mean, I even follow what the tigers are up to, what cubs they've had, who's died, and everything on Instagram, because I follow all the accounts of the photographers and guides.
Yeah, the wonders of technology to keep you connected like that. And I think your cat has sensed that we're having
I'm just
a
going to
praise session for tigers, and it's like, me too.
I'm going to open the door for her, otherwise she'll just keep meowing.
That's okay. What's your cat's name?
Mouse.
Mouse. Truly a poet's name for a cat, I would
Mhm.
say.
She's a feral cat, but she looks like a field mouse.
We were talking about the Tala Zone, which was
Yeah.
based off of this, I think, trip to the reserve. And one of the things that came to me when reading that section, which is this long, how would you describe it? Prose poetry section that is
Yeah.
this journey, this beautiful writing, let's say beautiful writing that explores this zone. And something that really was very evocative for me was smell, the smells that you write about within that poem. And then that made me kind of reread the correct collection just to look at where you talked about smell, because I feel like I read somewhere that smell is the sense that's most attuned to memory, like that you remember things most vividly through smell.
Yeah.
And I think for me, your poem Vial as well, I think you sniff a whole rainforest in
Yeah.
a vial and you take us through these olfactory maps. And I wanted to ask a little bit about writing through smell, and if it's something that you're intentionally drawn towards.
So the thing about smell is that, as you say, that it evokes memories that you can't remember, but you remember the smell. And so I do remember a lot of smells from my childhood where I've blanked experiences out. But the other really big thing about smell is that um, I've been to, for example, I've been to the Amazon rainforest 4 times. So
Mm.
twice I went to the Venezuelan Amazon and climbed Mount Roraima, which was really hard for me. And twice I've been to the Peruvian Amazon into a pristine um, rainforest reserve called Tambopata National Park, into the core of the reserve, where there is no human habitation apart from one research station. And in the research station, yes, tourists, ecotourists are invited in, and which pays for it. Um, but the difference between a pristine rainforest and one where humans live is smell, because it really smells. So you can smell all the peccaries. They're really stinky creatures. So they go around in a big herd. And even the trees, they give off scents to put, like the garlic tree, the shit tree, and they have spines and things. So the thing is that unless you're there, you're not going to know that it smells like that.
Mm.
And yeah, so and I suppose the other thing is that when I started making art as a child and then as a teenager, it was to survive in my imagination when I wasn't allowed to be myself with my mother. And I had to make that world really real so I could survive in it.
Mm.
Then I became a visual artist. I became a sculptor. Um, so I am primarily I see in images and in the other senses like smell.
Mm. Yeah, it was very evocative, and I the honesty of some of the stinky smells does come through in the work, and I don't think many people write about that. But I was really there, and I could feel it in my body. Um, and speaking of, you said the difference between the pristine forest and like a reserve or something that's kind of come in contact with humans in that kind of way. There's like a significant difference. And I was thinking about how we think about what constitutes nature writing today and how there's relatively few untouched so-called habitats on the earth anymore, but how nature can persist in different forms, like these vestige spaces, I wanted to say, which you write about in the book. So things like um, zoos, cellars, archives. I think there was a biobank, a museum, and how nature has persisted or survived in these remnants and ghosts and stem cells. And I think that's doing something really important because what are the forms of kinship we have with these remnants, even if they're remnants? And I thought that was it really made me think about what nature writing is doing. And yeah, I wanted to ask you about writing about those vestige spaces in the work and how they might be different to you writing the more untamed, untouched, wild.
Mm. Mm. So yes, so I had read about frozen zoos. So they are a real thing that I can't actually remember which natural history museums or zoos have a frozen zoo underground
Mm,
where they keep stem cells of almost extinct and extinct animals.
mm,
And so this is a real thing which really struck me that it's a way that we are trying, people who see, like the scientists who see uh, that the wild is disappearing, are trying to keep it. Um, so yeah, it's it just was something I really wanted to write about when I wrote Beast. That for example, the forests where the tigers are very restricted, which means that the tigers fight a lot and kill each other. Um, Daughters and mothers fight and do kill each other, and that's because there's not enough forest. So the forests are disappearing. The Arctic, and there's also something about trying to preserve the childhood of Earth and my what was good in my childhood. Um, so it's like, you know, how is the planet going to evolve? And it being a kind of Garden of Eden, and uh, wishing it was looked after better than it is. Um, but yes, and trying to, like the vial poem. So I tried to make the poem like a vial that contains remnants that have been preserved of the sense of the different places on Earth.
yeah, I was also I think there was this line from Beast of Bodmin. I could be stem cells in the vial of a frozen zoo waiting 100 years to wake. And for me, what also came through was this hopeful to me, I hope this is the case, the surety of nature to persist and rewild and come back. Um,
Mm.
you mentioned in like starting out as a visual artist or a sculptor. And I wanted to say that a lot of the poems for me reminded me of Anna Mendieta's work, like the Silhouetta series. They felt very textural, the poems, and dynamic in the way they they thought about materiality and silhouettes and what fills in what shape. Um, I wanted to ask how poetry compares to these other art forms that you've practiced before or still practice.
Mm. So I used to be a sculptor for about a year, and then I'd stop, and then I'd write for about a year, and I would be 100% that thing, and then I would revert. Um, so what poetry does with metaphor, um, I would struggle to do as a sculptor with material. So I worked with a lot of the materials that are in my poems. For example, I used thorns and I used birds, butterflies, beetles that I used to get given from the Natural History Museum in London. Uh, so in the end, I think towards the end of my 30s, I decided that it was easier for me to use metaphor than to use brute matter, brute materials, which I just wasn't quite good enough at making. And I made things that were too hard for me as well. So they were too big and too hard. I would make them different now if I had another go at it, if I could go back. But my main influences, I am of course influenced by a lot of poets and writers, but and even film. But I am very influenced by the visual artists, and
Mm.
I'm always exploring and seeing what new visual artists I can discover and be influenced by. And in my books, I think possibly about a third of the poems at least have touches of their work in them. So the ideas or the images have come from them. And it's a way of renewing my art and going out of my usual trope motifs and
Mm.
finding new ones, like, for example, Louise Bourgeois's huge spider called Maman became my mother, and she loved spiders, so it was a good thing for her. And the grand piano. So I thought, what can I write about a piano? And
Mm.
and then I
Was
remembered,
this Rebecca Horn?
yes, Rebecca Horn, and then thank you. And then I remembered, of course, being in the children's home when I was 5, and there being a grand piano, and so I wrote the poem. Having many, many times walked underneath Rebecca Horn's piano as it disgorged its keys and looked at it and thought, I could never write about that because it is a poem in itself.
Was it suspended from the
Yes,
ceiling? Or yeah, yeah,
from the ceiling, and it disgorged its keys and made a tremendous racket.
yeah.
Yeah, so I always thought, gosh, it's such a powerful piece. I'd love to write about that.
Yeah, I would love to get some visual artist recommendations from you, but we'll get to that. I one of the last questions I'll ask. Um, Actually, there's one more. But I wanted to talk a little bit about writing your novel, My Hummingbird Father, which recently came out, and what the process of writing a novel was like compared to writing a poetry collection, and maybe what did prose offer you? Like we've talked about what visual arts and like sculpting and poetry, how those two things are different, but maybe what's the commonality or difference between writing prose and poetry for you?
Um, So I think with the novel, which actually took me a long time to write,
Mm.
uh, because I was kind of building it like a sculptor making installations, and
Mm.
every chapter has a framing image and a sense as well. So like smell, taste, and so on. Um, it allowed me to go into a lot more expanse of description of and feelings and conversation as well. So,
Mm.
for example, because it is autofiction,
Dialogue. Yeah.
It's yeah, dialogue. Thank you. Yes, so there was a those conversations with my father. I wanted to capture them, and so I did kind of put them into the novel. Yeah, and also I hadn't been able to capture Angel Falls. And those incredible table mountains in Venezuela and Ayuntapuy, the one
Mm,
that I dream about so much. So I hadn't managed to do that, and I wanted to really try in the prose.
mm,
And it has more space to explore that. And I think in my very first book, Heart of a Deer, I did try, and I don't think I did very well. So I wanted to have another go at it.
I haven't read it yet, but I do have it with me. So I'm quite excited to sit with it after this one. Do you have any projects in the works? I know it's not a question that many people like to answer, but
Um, hmm. I've been incredibly busy kind of the past, I
Mm,
don't know, forever now, for about 6 months. And so I'm not really having writing time, but I don't feel very good unless I write. So I'm just writing at the moment, I'm just writing loads of rainforest haiku. So it's
oh.
just to kind of it's just to do something fun and afterwards have a look at them and see which ones might be any good. And also, actually, I've been writing about having an imaginary daughter who lives in the rainforest canopy because I could never climb to the top of the canopy tower
Mm,
in the rainforest. At Tambopata National Park, they have these very high canopy towers where the steps get slimmer and shake more, and I suffer from vertigo, so I never quite got to the top. But this daughter does. So
mm.
everything happens in the canopy.
You can imagine anything.
Yes.
Um, my last question for us before I would love for you to read a poem for us to close this out is can you give us three literature or film or visual artist recommendations to take away with us today?
Yeah. Oh, can it be six?
It can be six.
Okay. So there's an amazing book about to come out by Jay Griffiths called How Animals Heal Us. And I had the good fortune to read this when it was in proof. And it's one of my favorite books of all time. Then I always, Pablo Neruda is always in my imagination because of how he captures the richness of life on Earth. So especially his Canto General, his descriptions of the animals and birds, and this feeling of uh, the the steam rising from the forest floor, the birth of the planet that he captures there. And then there are three poets, contemporary poets, that I'd like to recommend. There's Natalie Diaz's
Oh,
post-colonial love poem.
that's one of my favorite books.
I just adore her work, yeah. And then Warsan Shire's Bless the Daughter Raised by a Voice in Her Head. So she is very special, I think, Warsan. And Zafar Kunyul, his book England's Green. So I would really recommend that too. Those are the ones everyone must read.
Thank you so much. Would you like to read one or two poems for us today?
Oh, thank you very much. So I'll read the opening poem, which is not a short poem. It's not too long, but it's not that short either. So I'd like to read this. Because it takes place in South Wales with my mother in the living room in a little doll's house estate. And at the same time, it takes place in the Tambopata National Park on the river. The river. started to flow when I was 13. It grew between me and my mother. I saw the jaguar bathe in the shallows. The cayman, with his crown of horseflies, accepted me as a friend. He led me to the swift center where nighthawks roosted on driftwood, raised their sleepy eyelids, and were not angered by my presence. They were forest dreaming as the current took me in its arms and whispered encouragement. My mother's chair seemed further away on the far bank, and I could no longer hear the words that stung. The river glittered with waves, and each was a picture I could paint or a book I could write. It was as if I'd entered a new element and could breathe water. My feet touched the bottom where stones told me their stories, and I listened. Capybaras barked a welcome, and even the cowbirds on their backs gurgled as they plucked botflies from their mounts. I plunged into the fertile world and swam to safety. I wrapped each wave around my neck like a shawl of sunlight. The anaconda swam with me, and every scale was a make-up mirror telling me I wasn't ugly. My brown eyes were not cowshit, but clean as the harpy eagles. Morphos drank my tears and fluttered on my lashes. Everywhere I looked, I saw my future was gilded blue. My black hair, mother had cropped to my scalp, grew into ringlets of vines on which jacamars and tanagers perched. Marmosets played in the coils and made me laugh. When I floated on my back, my breasts were two turtles drying their shells on a mud bank. And when the jaguar dived beneath me and lifted me up into the light, I clung to his back and rode my life.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Pascale.
Thank you so much for your wonderful questions. I think they were so deep and oh, I don't know, it's like you wrote the book.